to Fitzroy.
And the house is like 2 doors down, but she can't take it down. No, straight across.
Yeah, you might have to go all the way from summer to the sunrise just to get back to 2 blocks away from
Yeah.
It's crazy.
It's just like, see, I don't ever mind the wind too much. Because it blows out a lot of stuff.
I love the wind.
So I might as well just swing around and back.
Yeah.
I tried 5 times.
Hey, Dave, how are you? All right.
Good morning, sir. Blow me through the door.
Did you get blowed into?
Oh, yeah. Didn't show with me though. My hair's not too.
Yeah, show us something.
Yeah.
Well, you didn't go out this back and
Oh. I didn't go.
I was hoping it was you.
Good, I put minutes away.
How are you?
We're getting there.
Hey there, how are you? Good. Oh. Yeah, I'm sorry. No, don't even apologize. Where's your teacher? You gonna teach yourself today? Oh, grandma's stuff? Okay.
It's good to see everyone here this morning. We'll be getting started in just a second. As we begin, Bob, could you lead us in a word of prayer?
Our Father in heaven, we give you thanks today for the blessings that you continue to give us. And today, Father, we ask you that you help each one of us as students to listen intently, gain what we can from your word today. Father, we ask that you be with each of the teachers, that they might remember the lessons they prepared. And we pray in the name of Jesus Christ.
Amen. So what did we learn in our last class about where behavior comes from? Why do we do the things that we do? Jay? Comes from the heart, right? It comes out of the abundance of our heart. And that's why it's so important how we care for our heart, how we let our heart be shaped and transformed by God, by His Word, and to ensure that it doesn't become hardened, right? Because that can happen. That can happen when we let our motives get out of control, when we let our allegiance to God veer off to something else, is that it can corrupt our hearts. And out of that is going to come behavior that shows that. Behavior is basically the evidence of what is in our hearts. And just in thinking about this and kind of making the transition to our next section of scripture here, which will be in Matthew 12. If you're not open there already, let's go ahead and open our Bibles to Matthew 12. And we're going to be looking at verses 38 through 50 this morning. So the place that I currently work right now has a reputation for having a very rigorous interview process, and it's both long. There's a lot of different parts to it. You have to go through all these different. You basically end up interviewing with everybody that's going to be on your team individually as a group. We even do things like part of the interview is going out to lunch together with your team that you're going to be joining. And so oftentimes somebody will, especially when we're hiring from out of town, somebody will fly into Vegas. A shuttle driver from Zappos will go and pick them up and bring them to the office. They'll spend the whole day in different interviews with different people, with their team. They'll go out to lunch together. They talk to the recruiter. The shuttle driver drives it back to the airport, and they fly home. And that's the interview. That's just one part of the interview. There's interviews that happen before that over the phone. There may be follow-up ones if anybody still has any questions. But why I tell you that is because the reason why we go through all those things, the reason why, I guess to start, I should say, of course, what happens face to face with your team in the interviews is important, right? And how many of us have been on interviews? You know, some of us have, some of us may not have, but I think most of us have. And we know that beforehand, there's preparations that we make, right? We may even research what are good questions to ask an employer when you're interviewing there. You know, how can I show myself in the best light? You may research all about the company, all about the people. You do everything that you can to present yourself in the best light in that interview. You prepare for it, you do all these things. And because of that, because there's so much preparation that goes into it, it actually is really hard for somebody to find a candidate that's actually going to fit on that team or who is actually going to be a good employee, because everybody prepares for an interview, right? Everybody goes through this. Everybody's putting on their best face, putting their best foot forward. And it can be hard to hire the right people. This is something that all companies struggle with. And so I just want to focus in on one part of this. So there's all the usual interview stuff. Everybody, reports how they feel about the candidate, what they think. But there's a couple interviews that happen outside of the norm, right? And that's that we ask the shuttle driver, the person who picked them up from the airport, was basically like their taxi, how they treated them. How did their interaction go? When you're out to lunch with them, you observe how they interact with the waiter or the waitress at the restaurant, the people who they aren't trying to impress, right? And this goes a long way into seeing who that person really is, right? Because it's easy to put on a face for a little while. It's easy to put on your best behavior to get through maybe just a face-to-face with somebody you know about who you're trying to impress. But when you're trying to find out somebody's character, what their heart is like, as much as we can as humans, right? We don't have complete insight into the heart, but there's things that we can see. It's that character that's exposed by the way they treat people who they don't think they're trying to impress or who they don't think can help them, right? And that's even a principle that we read throughout scriptures. Even previously in our study in Matthew, that he criticizes people he's pointing out that, what good is it if you just love those who love you, right? Love those who are going to love you back. That everybody does that, right? You can't tell the character of somebody's heart just if they love those who love them, or if they're generous to those who are generous to them. If they're always questioning who is their neighbor, who do I need to treat right? Who do I need to treat correctly? That those aren't the things that reveal our hearts. It's how we treat those people who we're not trying to impress. And there's been times where that slips out. Just a year or two ago, somebody was interviewing at my company with a lady that I work with who was going to be their boss. But they didn't know that at the time. She's young. She's probably a little younger than I am. And they they came in and sat down in the interview, and they mocked the way she talked or something like that. Like they made a little bit of fun of her before they knew who she was. And right away, you see that's revealing. And that was only a small sign of things to come, other things that people notice as well. But this whole, anybody can fake something, especially for short bursts. But it's almost impossible over time. The more you get to know them, because of this idea of this character of the heart and how that comes out in our actions, especially to those who many might discount, especially to those who may be in positions of vulnerability, who we may not feel or some way we don't feel like we have to impress them. That's where the true character comes out. And that's the exact thing that's being exposed by these people that Jesus is confronting here with these Pharisees and others, that their character is being exposed, it's being revealed by their words, that it gives us insight into their heart. And of course, Jesus knew their hearts. Sometimes he would know things about them before they even spoke. But they had demonstrated the content of their hearts through the things that they said. And that was the point of this last passage that we touched on Wednesday night's class. And so I think one of the lessons we take away from that is that all of us have hearts that need to be transformed, right? None of our hearts are perfect. None of us have the perfect motives. That everyone has these hearts that constantly need to be transformed, because it's out of that our actions, that our words are going to come from. Billy, you have a comment?
Yeah, I think going along with what you said there about an interview, anytime you do an interview for a company, well, you want to learn about the company first, and then you learn your good points that you can make that company even better. You want to stress them. You don't want to stress your bad points. So you learn about the company, and that applies to your attitude. And then your attitude with God is the same thing. We have to present ourselves to God. God is perfect. We don't have to worry about Him changing or giving us a different answer. All the answers that are in the Word that we need. But here again, we need to prepare ourselves for God. When you make the first step to being baptized and set your course for God, that's the reason we're here this morning. We study the Word so that we can be a better Christian for God.
Yeah, well, and He provides us with truth that can reshape us, and that's how we learn to please Him, is to have hearts that are open to His teachings, open to His Word. And it's not just that we're trying to impress Him, right? Just, it's not a superficial thing, right? That's kind of, what I think what you're hinting at with this idea of going into an interview. What the story I was sharing is that it shouldn't just be superficial. We should learn what really matters and pursue those things. And that's in all areas of life, but especially in our relationship to our Father and towards each other, towards everyone, should be genuine, should come from the heart. And we know that by this point in the story where we are right now, they've already been looking for ways to harm Jesus, to trap Him, to even kill Him, to put Him to death. And these are things that are revealing what their heart is, what their intent is. And so, this is what we're getting to right now. And let's go ahead and read our main text, and then we'll get into some of this. But what we begin reading about here is them seeking a sign, and this is the first of a number of times they're going to do this, even within Matthew, but throughout the Gospels we read about this, and even into Acts. So let's read verses 38 through 50. Terry, can you read that for us?
Then certain of the scribes and of the Pharisees answered, saying, Master, we would see a sign from thee. But he answered and said unto them, An evil and adulterous generation seeketh after a sign, and there shall no sign be given to it, but the sign of the prophet Jonas. For as Jonas was 3 days and 3 nights in the whale's belly, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh shall rise in judgment with this generation, and shall condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonas, and behold, a greater than Jonas is here. The queen of the south shall rise up in the judgment with this generation, and shall condemn it, for she came from the uttermost parts of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And behold, a greater than Solomon is here. When the unclean spirit is gone out of a man, he walketh through dry places, seeking rest, and finding none. Then he saith, I will return into my house from whence I came out. And when he is come, he findeth it empty, swept, and garnished. Then goeth he and taketh with himself 7 other spirits more wicked than himself, and they enter in and dwell there. and the last state of that man is worse than the first. Even so shall it be also unto this wicked generation.
Okay, we could stop there for now, even though I think the last part can tie into it. We're not even going to get there, so we'll just leave it to these two sections here, where we read this parallel that he gives in the first part of this sign of Jonah, referring back to Jonah, to Nineveh, to that whole story that I know most of us are pretty familiar with. But then also to this idea of this return of an unclean spirit. And, it's like we're in late October. It's kind of like it describes him as a house here. It's like a, we have lots of, we see like haunted houses. We see things like that all over right now. And I think this story here gives us a lot of insight as well into even more insight into what it means to have a heart that is full, that is intent on pleasing God and on being genuine, and that is prepared to move us to move people to the correct actions and to have the right motivations, the right intents. And so I think these two points that he's making here play really well off each other, as we'll discover as we go through this. So, so this idea of seeking a sign, right, which is what they were doing. It says in verse 38 that some of the scribes and Pharisees answered him saying, "Teacher, we want to see a sign from you." Had they not seen any signs from Jesus?
Yes.
Right, they had. They had already seen many things that he was working among them. That they were, I'm sure they heard about ones that they hadn't seen, but yet they still come to him, asking him for further signs. And like I mentioned, this is the first in a series. This isn't the only time they're asking for this. We see it also if we just turn over a couple chapters to chapter 16. Matthew 16. And let's read verses 1 through 4. Lajana, can you read those for us?
Yes. The Pharisees also with the Sadducees came, and tempting desired him that he would shew them a sign from heaven. He answered and said unto them, When it is evening, ye say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning it will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and lowering. O ye hypocrites, ye can discern the face of the sky, but can ye not discern the signs of the times? A wicked and adulterous generation seeketh after a sign, and there shall no sign be given unto it, but the sign of the prophet Jonas. And he left them and departed.
All right, so we see even a little more insight being given here into what exactly he's criticizing, right? And I think, we could already gain some of it just by knowing the history that we've already come to in Matthew, but here a little later, it even describes it here as they're coming to test him, right? They're always looking for ways to catch him in something, to have some kind of evidence or proof to use against him, not to use in application to themselves, right? When we approach a situation, we either approach it because we're either looking to correct somebody else, or we're looking to correct ourselves. And with them, it was always, in these kind of encounters that they had with Jesus, they were never looking for what truth they could apply to themselves, right? They were never looking for what they had to learn from this great teacher. And even if they recognized the greatness of what he said, we know that many people did. This is a common pattern that we've seen throughout Matthew so far, is the different reactions that happen from the exact same words that Jesus teaches. To some people, their hearts are open to it and they're transformed by it. Other people, their hearts are closed and they become even more hardened and even more opposed to him. And that's another example of what we see them moving towards right here is that. Chuck?
Even today, a lot of people enter Bible study with that concept of proving somebody wrong. You enter like a denomination. You want to show them where they're wrong. You're not studying just to help yourself too.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, I obviously like there are going to be cases where we are trying to test things, but in those cases, when it's done right, it's because both parties will have a heart that wants to know what's right. And that's why, like, a lot of studies will, I know we like to, in personal studies, it's good to begin by acknowledging like the common ground that we have and acknowledging the respect that we have for God's word, what we think about it, making sure we agree on kind of the base level stuff before we just go in trying to argue with each other, trying to prove somebody wrong. It should always come from a place of love for each other, of God, and a respect for his word. If we don't share those things, progress can't really be made. And that's kind of what Jesus is running into, is there are people here who are approaching things with wrong motives. And it's like, it's like running into a brick wall. He's not effective in changing them, and he can't be, because the heart has to be right in order to be changed. And that's a pattern that we've seen, and we're going to continue to see. Terry?
This reminds me of the Pharisees, the Old Testament, when God kept giving them signs. It's almost as if these Pharisees are, keep giving me another sign. All I want is another sign. And it seems like Jesus is getting frustrated. Like, I've already given you signs. You're not paying attention. And they keep asking for more and more and more. When if they would just listen to the few that they got before that, then it just seems like they don't want to pay attention. That's not what they want to hear. They want something else.
Right. Well, it's revealing their heart, that they're not actually seeking for what the signs are there to back up. They see that as a threat. Yeah. And so they're trying to like squash this threat, as opposed to being open to the things they've already seen, like you're saying. Barry?
As you just brought up, that he just healed a guy that was blind and new.
Yeah.
And then they said he was doing it by the power of Beelzebub. And now we're on the side. Well, he had just healed somebody.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't accept it. But we also see that as we go through all these books, he never stopped. It's because they were always there testing him. A lot of times he used what they were trying to use against him. He used to teach at least the ones that were there and would listen. But he never stopped teaching. He got frustrated, but he never stopped teaching. Even trying to teach them. Again, that's something that's really hard for us. We get frustrated and we go, okay, that's on top of this. But Jesus never stopped teaching all the way up to the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and right, he didn't stop performing signs, but he wouldn't do it at their command. Right now, that's what we're seeing. He wasn't going to do it just to show off or just to appease their manipulation, which is what they were often involved in, is trying to like manipulate things or set up scenarios where they could catch him in something. Did you have a comment? Yeah.
Even though he knew their hearts, he still kept giving them an opportunity to change. He by the things he kept saying to them, every word that you speak, every idle word you speak, that's how you're gonna be judged. So you're being given an opportunity to change. And he knew their hearts. So he still gave them an opportunity to change, and they did.
Yeah. Well, and in the kind of the larger context of what we're studying right here, this last sign is still a sign. The sign of Jonah that he's pointing towards, it's intended for them as much as it is for us, right? As much as we look back on his death and his resurrection, it was a sign to them as well. And we see that sign did have a great effectiveness, even among the leaders, even among those who may have opposed him before, who were for putting him to death. Not that it changed everyone. There's still many hearts that were refusing to be transformed, just as there are today. But right, patience is something that he had with them. It's something that we have with those who may have hard hearts the first time we study with them, the first time we talk to them. But yet we've all been there, right? And so we have patience with them. We look to our Lord as well, who's the perfect example of that. Even though he would call them out on things because he had this special insight into their hearts. Even the disciples oftentimes would ask for signs, and a little later in Matthew 24, Matthew 24 and verse. Signs were something that people asked for. It wasn't wrong to ask for a sign, but because oftentimes they were supposed to. If somebody was making a great claim, it was only right to ask for a sign to back that up. But in Matthew 24 verse 3, just an example of the disciples doing this. He says, "And he sat on the Mount of Olives, or as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, 'Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?'" So it's not uncommon to ask for a sign, to know what to look for. Let's look over at Mark chapter 8 as well. Mark 8. And here we have him, again, the Pharisees coming to him, Mark chapter 8, verses 11 and 12. And Barry, can you read that for us?
Then the Pharisees came out and began to dispute with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven, testing him. But he sighed deeply in the spirit and said, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Assuredly I say to you, no sign shall be given to this generation."
Okay, so here we see the effect that it had on Jesus, like we just was just mentioned a little bit ago, that he recognized that they're doing this to test him. They weren't doing this because their faith, they weren't quite at the point of believing, and they needed some extra proof in order to see, to confirm the things that he was saying. It says no, that they were seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. And it says that he sighed deeply in his spirit, that this is something that was disappointing to Jesus. We read about Paul and how Paul had a lot of care for the Jews. His desire was to see them brought back into the family of God, to restore their faithfulness. Well, of course, Jesus would have that too. And I think this disappointed him to see this generation falling into this kind of state that they were. And
Well, it's almost like they're, what's the word? I lost my train of thought. Almost like they're wanting him to be showing off, I guess is the best way, in front of other men and seeking that. But that's not why he does what he's doing.
mm-hmm.
And there are reasons why he does not, every time they say, "I want a sign," or "I want you to do this," they're not even paying attention to anything that's going on around them.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, he's not gonna be showing off, to get praise and bend. And that's almost like what they're wanting.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. He's not doing this just to wow people, just to get attention for himself or anything like that. Oftentimes he would do a sign, he would be like, "Don't tell anybody about this."
Yeah.
At least not yet, and of course now we have a lot of even those ones recorded for us because of testimony that was given to the writers, eyewitness testimony, who saw those things, who experienced those things, and who obviously did tell about them eventually. But yeah, he's not falling into their traps. He's not, he's not just giving in to their shallow requests, which is what they were. They weren't looking for the deep things of God. They were looking for this just shallow things and oftentimes with wrong motives. Let's also look at just 1 Corinthians, just one verse from here that we could see that this is something that like characterized many of the Jews, especially of that time. So 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 22, it says, "For Jews demand signs, and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and folly to the Gentiles." And of course, there's a lot of context around here as well that can give us even more insight into what was going on and how how it's the signs aren't enough. Just seeing the signs aren't enough to make someone right, or to they were never the purpose. They were never the focus of things. The focus was always on what was being taught. The focus was on Jesus himself, which we're going to see in our next passage. Billy?
Yeah, I think we fall into the same category sometimes. The way we pray for wisdom or pray for understanding or knowledge or whatever. And just like when we pray for it, if God don't answer it in our thoughts, we think he's not hearing us or not going to answer it. But here again, they're basing their thoughts and attitudes on earthly wisdom, not heavenly wisdom. It's not always the same.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to remember that. Just because we think it should be this way, that's not God's way. But sometimes it's in our head just from being the way we are.
Yeah.
So we have to watch that.
Yeah.
We'll be just like them.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, and I think that's a whole other direction we could take this. Like even in studying this, like there's whole lessons I see in here of course ways that we fall into these same things. Sometimes we want, we expect things on our terms, right? Even if it's subconscious, even if we don't intend for it to be that way. Sometimes our expectations, we can be disappointed when things don't work out like we wanted them to, even when we're praying about them, and we're sometimes we just want things on our terms, right? And I think that's something that's very natural to us. It's human, but right, it's like too narrow of a perspective. It's not taking into account so many things that we don't know. It's not in a way, it's not putting our full faith in God when that happens. So right, there's weaknesses that we share that we can see reflected in ourselves when we see him criticizing these attitudes that might be on the extreme end of that. But of course, anytime we read these, we should be seeing somewhat of a reflection of ourselves in them. So I think that's a good point. I appreciate that. Any other comments or hands that I've missed?
Look how hard-hearted Pharaoh was. Look at all of the signs that God gave him. He just was mean and ornery and stubborn. He needed a good licking. He just wouldn't listen.
Right. Well, we had no respect for the God who was giving the signs, and that's why it's interesting that let's turn over to John 6, because I think this kind of ties into this conversation we're having here. So in John 6. And it was hard to pick out a section in this chapter because the whole chapter is kind of focusing on these things, and it's just a really powerful story the way it's put together here. But just for the sake of time, let's read verses 28 through 35. And Michelle, can you read those for us?
Then they said to him, "What shall we do that we may work the works of God?" Jesus answered and said to them, "This is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he sent." Therefore they said to him, "What sign will you perform then, that we may see it and believe you? What work will you do? Our fathers ate the manna in the desert, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat." Then Jesus said to them, "Most assuredly I say to you, Moses did not give you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Then they said to him, Lord, give us this bread always. And Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst.
The transition that's made here from this people wanting to see a sign and referring back, look what Moses did. He would give us signs. And this is in the context following them being fed and still following him and wanting more. And he was, he's recognizing maybe some conflict in them as well, that, are you following me for just to be fed, to see, and even to witness the signs? Or is it because you actually want what I have to give, what I really have to give? Right. And that's the powerful turning point here, is they're looking for a sign and they're equating that with the bread. And Jesus says, what? I am the bread, right? I am the bread. I am the sign, basically, right? Which he was. Even all the signs that he did were pointing towards the claims that he was making, right? And the things that he was doing, which was showing that he was God. He was God in the flesh, that he was the Messiah, that he was the king that they had been waiting for, that he was the one ushering in the kingdom. All these different claims that he had, that he was making, little by little, kind of building that up, were, the signs were attesting to those things. They were attesting to him and to who he said he was. And that's what the people needed to see, right? They didn't need to see a plate full of more food. Right? They needed to see what that was all pointing towards. Who could even do something like that? That's what they needed to recognize, that who Christ was, and what he was doing. And so this one, I think, really kind of wraps up this whole thing, even though it's not talking about it in quite as negative a sense as it is with the Pharisees, that it's still pointing to the same thing, which is, my signs are going to do no good if you don't accept what I'm bringing to you, if you don't accept me, and my words, the teaching that I'm giving you. John?
Well, unfortunately, man looks at things in an earthly manner. These disciples and all these people were still looking for a earthly kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
So, they couldn't relate to spiritual and what God was looking at one thing in one light, they were looking at it in another light. And, it leaves a big separation there.
Mm-hmm.
They were still, the disciples were looking for an earthly kingdom. And that wasn't what God was talking about.
Right, yeah, and a lot of them had a hard time accepting that.
It comes back to the plan. God's plan is set, and we don't. We want them to adapt it to our way of thinking, and it doesn't work that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's like, what is that? When it doesn't adapt to our way of thinking, what is our response to that? Right? It's like that. That's what makes the difference. Do we change our thinking, or do we, do we give up,
or we reject it,
or do we reject it? Right. Those are the responses. It's responses to the same thing, just like we've seen throughout the story, that Jesus is doing the same thing wherever he goes. Right. We read about what he was doing village to village, that he was teaching the same things, that he was doing signs, and look at the variety of responses that we see. Right. And it all comes down to their heart, and it describes them as this evil and adulterous generation. Right. In what way were they adulterous?
They left God. They betrayed. They've been unfaithful to God.
Unfaithfulness to God, right? That's the idea of this adulterous generation. And we talked about the evil part before, that kind of comes from their motives and what that was driving them to do. That corrupt motives will corrupt your behavior. And so, maybe just in preparation for the next class, let's kind of get reacquainted with the story of Jonah. It's only, I think it's 4 chapters. It's really short book. But even just kind of reading through that again and seeing what happened with him in Nineveh, and because we'll be getting in depth on that into this in this next section as we continue our study. Thanks for all the comments.
Thank you.
No, you don't have to. I didn't get it down.
This
She'll get there.
How are you?
She did.
Okay.
City. Yeah, that's Are you? Okay. Yeah. So, read. Don't you reach me like this. Don't be like stories.
Don't show it. You know why it's short? Even though it's
Yeah. He said, "Let's make it burn." I said, "Well, I couldn't do that. You went from here and out of 6 months to 15 tonight."
You cut everything out.
Yeah, he went there and poured that shit out.
You're gonna go out.
Please do that.
Yeah. You're sitting.
That's what she is. Yeah. Sure, growing up. And this foundation. It's very. How are you, sir?
First time I'll get this. Actually, we have.
I feel comfortable today. Oh, man.
First saw campus. It was like so weird. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah.
It's great. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, I told you that would work.
I think this was Jerry's list.
I have a list. I really do. In my phone. That's good.
Yes, I have.
Oh, yeah.
Sometimes I think it's.
Yeah, start combination, then you change that combination. That's how it just grows and grows and